Uh-oh, got awesome. Hey everybody, excited to be here and thank you for joining. We're just going to start, we've got a lot to cover, so we're going to jump right in. I'm going to start with introducing the absolutely wonderful Cat. So Cat Coffrin is a speaker, coach, and consultant who helps senior corporate executives reclaim their identities, navigate career transitions, and define their personal brands. As founder of Captivating Consulting, Cat has advised hundreds of leaders across Fortune 100, startups, mid-sized firms, and nonprofits. Cat regularly writes and speaks for Fast Company, Chief, and companies including Deloitte, Accenture, Shutterfly, Capital One, and Microsoft. And on top of it, she's just a delight.
Well, thank you, Kinsey. And I feel like I have to return the favor. So for anyone here who does not know Kinsey, and I assume we have a few people maybe who haven't had the chance to meet you before, Kinsey Wolf is a growth marketing strategist and fractional CMO for future-focused technology companies. And she is the founder of Polaris Growth Studio. Kinsey specializes in sustainable, scalable marketing strategies that build momentum and put your company on the map. Her thought leadership has been recognized by partners in publications like Forbes, NASDAQ, and Buffer. And also, she's just a wonderful person who's always fun. I feel like I always learn something new when I talk to you. And you also help me sort of see topics I do think I understand in a totally new light. So it's a great trait to have.
Thank you so much. And I could say the same about you. So let's jump in. What is personal branding in your opinion?
So I knew you were going to ask that, because obviously you do this without that question. And at first I saw that and I was like, Kinsey, it's tricky, right? But here's what I found myself thinking about this morning as I was having my cup of coffee and looking forward to this conversation. I've realized that personal branding is getting conflated and confused with a couple of other things, understandably. I think personally, I look at personal branding at its core as being about the process of exploring and knowing and also giving language to what matters to you and what you want the world to know about you, right? Taking some control over how you're seen and how you're known. But I do think that what's happening here is a lot of people, especially in the corporate space where we both spend most of our time, confuse personal branding with other things like thought leadership, which is something you do a lot of, and also influencers. And so I find in my work a lot of aversion to the topic of personal branding. And sometimes I kind of relish in that because I get to kind of dig in and ask people why they're averse to it. But I think part of it is that confusion, is that people think if you're even going to explore or talk about your own personal brand, that immediately you're going to start talking a lot, right? Or you're going to be egotistical, or you're going to try to become Brene Brown or Kim Kardashian. And those are all fair. But to me, as a brand strategist, whether I'm branding a company or a product or a person, I'm focused on the strategy first, which is where I see the greatest value. The strategy is about having the self-knowledge of what you care about, what words do justice to you, how you talk about you, and being intentional how you want to show up, influencing thought leadership, even what you do or don't post online or how you show up. Those are just activations against your strategy.
Yes, I love the way you articulated that. If y'all don't know, I worked with Kat in an event that she doesn't do anymore, but that was really helpful to me. And it really, what was so crystallizing is what you just said about words that do you justice, because it gave me the confidence. I wasn't really posting on LinkedIn I wasn't doing any of that. It just gave me it gave me the confidence to be like, no, this is what I'm about. This is what I love. This is what motivates me. This is why I do the work that I do. And just the clarity and the self-knowledge made it easier to do everything else, and took a lot of the stress of how do you show up, because you get over yourself, it's just confident then.
Well, there's nothing worse than either being the person who is doing or the person who is observing and consuming content in the absence of strategy. So the stuff that I think all of us probably collectively feel a little cringy about, and I'm just going to use LinkedIn because I know that that's where a lot of this is anchored right now, is when you see something that's just there for the sake of being there, and you cannot ascertain or even intuit what the point is. And then you think about being the person who's like, I know I should be posting. I'm supposed to be doing this. There's a lot of shoulds and supposed tos, and I don't really know why. And then you do something and you can tell when it feels like there's no heart in it. That's the stuff that gives personal branding a bad rap, because that is in the absence of an actual strategy of why are you doing this? The number one stumbling block when I'm working with a leader and executive on their personal brand is, what's your objective? But I think we all know in practice of any work that we do, you never build a strategy without an objective, because how are you going to know if it's serving anything, or what's the point of it? How do you know if it's
That's
successful?
right.
And everybody's strategy is different. So there are people, I think of it kind of on a spectrum. There's people who come to me and say, I do want to be the next Brene Brown, right? To pick on her. And so I need a strategy that's going to differentiate me from people in this field, that's going to set me up. I need to write all the content that's going to differentiate me and think about the platforms where I'm going to be. And then there's people who maybe are in the middle of the spectrum and they're thinking, I'm probably going to want to make a change in my career, maybe in the next couple of years. And I'm not quite sure what I'm going to do. I just spoke to a woman this morning who's been doing patient experience work in healthcare for 20 years. She's so impressive. She's so awesome. And I'm like, what do you want to do with the rest of your life? She doesn't need to make a change, but she feels something in her saying, eventually I'm going to want to probably explore something new. I can tell. And so what do I do today to set myself up for that? And for her, the personal brand strategy is going to look very different, because she doesn't need to be on the cover of Forbes, but she does need to be very thoughtful and intentional about what brings her joy, what her greatest value is, how she is known in ways that she's aware of and ways she's not. And then how does she use language to describe, does she want to talk about patient experience? Is it not about the patients? Is it only about the patients? And where does she, how does she use that? And then there's people sort of on the other end of that spectrum who come to me. And frankly, I have a huge soft spot for these people because I relate to them, and they're broken. And they're like, oh my God, I'm 25 years into working, got an Ivy League degree. I've done all of these amazing things, and I have no idea who I am anymore. I feel a little bit beat up by a system where I'm told to blend in, that I have to just exist at my company, keep my head down, do good work, wait to be noticed, right? This corporate culture that we're all struggling with, that I think is rapidly getting outdated. And they're like, I just need to reconnect with who I am so that I can even start to find some energy again and figure out what would be meaningful to me. And I don't think people think of those kinds of discoveries when they think of personal branding, but it is. It's so important to us.
It is. That is, thank you so much for, kind of painting that spectrum, because I was going to ask, like, what are quote unquote good outcomes, or what are good reasons to be approaching personal branding? And what I'm hearing, correct me if I'm wrong, is that, the reason you do it is to know yourself better and be more confident in how you show up.
Yes.
What am I missing?
Right. And is that so silly? I did a podcast episode recently with Sandia Sudhakar. I don't know if you know her. I think she's a friend we might have in common. And she focuses on the very introspective side of this, right? She's an executive coach, and she works with teams on things like Enneagram, right? And knowing yourself. And what's interesting as we were talking is we both share the goal. And I think the outcome in a lot of cases of helping people feel more connected to who they are and why, and having like language to say, oh, I'm an activator, which is a strength finder, right? I don't know the Enneagram language, but people use that and they feel connected to it because everybody wants to be seen and understood. And they even want to understand themselves, and gives them like a vernacular and a language of talking about it. But what I would say is I kind of pick up from that space and I say, okay, so if you do have this self-awareness, we may need to go through and find it together. A lot of times I feel like I act like a mirror to be like, do you see the patterns? Because we don't see. That's not how we're wired to think about ourselves. You need that help. And then to say, okay, now let's give this some language and give you the confidence to start showing up everywhere with that intention. So if you're going to post on LinkedIn 5 days a week, I do that because it's my number one business driver, but also it's a really satisfying way for me to keep listening to what I'm learning and sharing wisdom, and it connects me with the most interesting people out there. So if you're going to do that, you need to know why. It goes back to that objective. So to your question about what are some good outcomes, of course, it depends on your objective. And I do think that the common thread, maybe to your point, if this is done well, is the number one outcome is you're going to feel more connected to who you are. And you have to recognize, I think we all would benefit from recognizing more that it's common the further you go in your career to feel more disconnected from who that is. I look at my 10-year-old daughter all the time as like the pinnacle of self-knowledge. And then, the closer I'm now in my 40s, and like you start to actually feel really disconnected from who that 10-year-old is. But there's a lot of truth in who we were at the most unfiltered version of our lives that still shapes who we are today.
Yes.
And that's when I think that we do this well. I'm still remembering when you did my boot camp, and I have this image for some reason of us talking about like your neighborhood where you grew up and you're riding on a bike. And like, we talked a little bit about the circumstances of your childhood. Like that stuff stays with you. And now when I talk to you, a little bit of that version of Kinsey. But the other thing I should say, just because this came across my desk the other day, I have another client who I just adore, who's at a really awesome design firm, and not like in a rush to move on, has been there for a while, but kind of knows, feeling a little, not quite stuck, but seeing the stuck on the horizon. And just kind of wondering those questions of like, what do I have to say about all this stuff I spent all this time doing? What do I know about it that I could share with the world? And we did come into this thinking of it more as a thought leadership strategy for her, mostly to capture what she knows, get more focus on what she's interested in doing, what she has to offer, and share that. And she has been posting pretty regularly, and it's been so much fun to watch her voice kind of come out. She's got this really original take on a lot of the work she does. And she just sent me a note the other day and said, I just got outreach from a woman who's a recruiter in this specific space that I want to be in, explicitly because she's seen my content on LinkedIn and wanted to connect. And I thought, that's it. That is it. And so in the moments we feel vulnerable, putting something out there, we have to remember you have no idea who might need to hear what you have to say, who might benefit from it, and also who might end up listening. And if we just stay here in our minds and we don't post, we're not giving any serendipity a chance to come out and surprise us, right? We're putting all the pressure on ourselves to answer all the questions instead of sort of meeting the universe halfway.
Totally. What you said just resonated so much. I think there's like an entire universe of high-performing perfectionists who are like terrified to show up on LinkedIn. And instead you end up being like, oh, this is so cringy and I hate these long-winded posts or whatever. And the reality is like building a community or a network or an audience or whatever word you want to use based on whatever your goals are does require you showing up in a way that probably feels a little bit vulnerable, and not everybody's going to like it. And that's like part of it. I think that's something you really, kind of in the boot camp, that's something you really encouraged all of us to do. Like just get more comfortable sharing a little bit more of yourself. And like, it's not going to be for everybody. And if you don't like it, you don't have to keep doing it, but you kind of just get started, just try.
And isn't it more interesting, right, to allow yourself to maybe say something that's not for everybody and to embrace that and accept that? I actually saw an old friend in DC this week, and he's, at a different point in his career and possibly is going to be retiring or moving on to that like mid to late career phase. A lot of people think of as a portfolio stage where you go out of like a full-time C-suite type role into maybe a combination of board roles and consulting or whatever. And he was like, I really appreciate what you do, but I would never do this. And I was like, well, you wouldn't do it unless you had a good reason to do it, right? So if you want to get some board seats in 5 years and you're a white male, right? People aren't necessarily out there actively recruiting for white male board seats. Right. There are some places where they're actually looking for board people that are non-traditional. And so there's sort of a different thing going on over there. But for someone like that, I would say, you need to, if you set aside your ego and say, I'm not the kind of person who does that, right? You need the attention. But if you think about your goals 1, 2, 3, or 5 years from now, where you'd like to be, how can you start doing some work to figure out what you have to say now, sending signals so it doesn't feel forced 3 to 5 years from now when you start to reach out to contacts and say, I'm looking for board opportunities. And people are like, well, what do you have to offer? And you don't know how to answer that question. It's like stuck in these cycles.
That's right. And the engaging with yourself and finding out what you have to say is part of the process. It really is not, it's not like you just, how many of us have sat down to journal and like nothing comes out? It's a muscle you have to flex, and how you show up and what you say and who you connect with is that all like, it takes practice. Actually, it is not just, it's not just like easy, simple. It takes, you have to do the hard introspective work. And also, it's to your point. You're not necessarily building for attention, but building for connection and community and a network and opportunities and all those things.
There are a lot of people out there who I think do this for attention.
Yeah.
And you have to kind of look at yourself and say, and I think I know a lot of people who do work that's similar to mine and do similar strategies to mine for business development and outreach. And we constantly have to kind of come back to home base when you get astray. And you might have that experience of like, I shared some content and it didn't really perform, and now I feel like a failure because you are out there. You use the word vulnerable. I think that's really common. I'd be curious, actually, now that I'm thinking about how much I see you sharing. I love the content you post out there, and none of it ever feels like it's noisy or for attention. It's always whenever Kinsey posts, like my gut reaction is this is going to be something interesting and thoughtful. And the work you do is a little bit different, and adjacent maybe to some of mine. Some of your customers are a little different than mine. So I'm always interested to see what's there. But I'm curious what you would say to someone who is in the position you were maybe 4 years ago. Like what, looking back from even the boot camp onward, has surprised you as you've started to use voice more? What advice would you give somebody?
Such a fun question. My advice would be very simple, like be consistent. Just set yourself a small goal and do it regularly. But what has been most surprising is how collaborative it is. What I post is almost always comes out of a conversation I had with another real person, and it was resonant, or somebody said like, "Oh, that's really interesting," or "Aha," or whatever. And that's like that process of being in conversation with other people and getting that feedback and being like, there's something to this idea, it's worth sharing with more people, has been like it's more about, like all things, it's more about listening than just like pushing out your ideas all the time. And it is I don't know, I think you're a creative person, so I think you might resonate with this. Something, when you're actively making art, the process of making it helps you see more opportunities for more art around you. You kind of cultivate this creative lens. And there's something about being more thinking about like what is resonating when you're having a conversation with somebody, like keeps you more present in the conversation. And so it's like a fun practice anyway, but it has the added benefit of helping me come up with cool conversations to start.
That, though. Like, how great is that? I love that point because it's so true. And I find I just gave a speech yesterday in DC, and I was thinking it was the third time I've given this speech to this organization, different audience, but same client and same topic. And every year it feels a little bit different because every year I come to that stage and I have engaged so much. It's a two-way street. And so the stuff that I'm saying now is different than even like when you and I did our boot camp. A lot of the same content on paper might be the same, but the anecdotes, the stuff that like brings it to life, the stuff that really adds value, is all coming from real life examples and feedback that I've heard. And it allows me to tap into a mindset to know that people come to the table reticent about this topic, and then to use that to my advantage to kind of break it open and draw them in. And I do think you're exactly right. For me, it's the same exact thing. Like the gratifying nature of this is all in the interactions. And for anybody who's marketing or building a business, whether it's your own business or inside of another company, how gratifying to have someone you can have real-time feedback.
Oh yeah.
But incredible. I think it's nervous. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. That's so true. Yeah. I had a friend who was like, how do you just like basically, I'm afraid to do it. And I was like, get over yourself. Like,
get over yourself.
Yeah. Like, just show up.
Piece of advice today.
Yeah, exactly.
I even said that in my speech yesterday. I was like, I know that there's people, as I was going through my like work framework and my advice, I know there's people who are immediately rolling their eyes saying, this is nice, but it's not for me and I'll never do it. Yeah. And it's like, the moment you realize everybody comes to it with that, and yet we persist anyway, because there's so much to be gained from being that in touch with yourself. This is the moment you're going to get over yourself and you're going to start to have a lot more fun.
Yes, absolutely true. Haters are so 2023. So can you build a personal brand, if you don't like social media?
Yes, I was just thinking about that. I was thinking we should talk about that for those skeptics among us. I get the speech that I referenced. I remember when I did it last year, there was someone in the audience who raises her hand. These were manufacturers, women in manufacturing. And she goes, I loved your presentation. Do you have a version of this whole speech for introverts? And it always makes me laugh when I think about that, because really what she was saying is like, I don't want to go post stuff in the public forum. That makes me really uncomfortable. So I loved that at the outset, we kind of set apart that what we're talking about fundamentally is not even assuming or presuming to go into your thought leadership or visibility. We're talking about knowing yourself and knowing what you stand for, what kind of unique value you bring to every room. I always talk about the fact that every single person, everybody, has a certain distinct, unique way that they change the energy of any room they walk into. there's even people that I regularly interact with on Zoom, like group meetings, whatever. And it's like their box pops in and you kind of smile because you're like, oh, they're here. Right. Like we all, and then there's the person who comes in and everyone gets serious. And just knowing, like I show up on the stage and I'm so happy to be on a stage because I love talking to people and I immediately am smiling. And I know that that has an effect on people because it's not a fake smile. They're like, this person's happy to be in the room. And now I'm kind of happy to be here too. And once you realize that our value isn't just like my degree, it's not just my skill set or every single accomplishment and bullets on my resume, but your value is also in just like how you move about the world. And it's even more powerful when you connect that and a knowledge of what that is and what's sort of special about that. So I'm always interested to talk to people about, do you know how you show up? Do you know what people value and like the way Kinsey appears and the thoughtful way that I always feel like you're really, really listening to what I say? You always have this look on your face when we chat, even if it's just like a catch up for 5 minutes. You're like, huh. And I always am like, she's thinking something that I'm going to learn from, even just because I'm talking, right? And you tell me something new about something I know. And I love that about you. But then for you to actually be able to harness that, it's not just about what you're going to do on LinkedIn with that knowledge. That's going to change the way. I have had clients recently who said, because of the work we did together, I started to get better at evaluating my options. And my head exploded because I thought so many people are in career transitions right now, voluntarily or not. And you feel sort of down on yourself when you're not confident about the job you're in, when you have to accept that you have to do something different. You're not sure. You can't control the whole thing. You don't know who's going to hire you. But to be able to know yourself well enough to really be discerning, to be able to discern what's the best opportunity for you. That's one way. The other ways that I often mention that you can use this is in when you have a strong sense of your brand. Even if we were to take a page from like the book of consumer goods or apparel, like the Patagonia brand.
Right.
And imagine Patagonia walking into a room at a party. Like, how are they going to show up? And that's still a use of the way that the fact that they send me emails that have nothing to do with sales or their products speaks volumes about what they stand for as a brand, because it's not necessarily what you'd expect. And if you're a leader who really wants everyone on your team to feel genuinely understood, you might use your brand to say, hey, I would love to take some time at the beginning of every all hands meeting and just share something that sometimes gets misunderstood so that we can all do better to know each other. So I know, for example, I have a huge bias towards action. I talk fast, I move fast, I take half-baked ideas to market. I have no patience for fiddling with things until they're perfect. I have learned that that's really uncomfortable for people who are perfectionists. And I'm not necessarily interested in working hard to change what I do, but so much as saying, hey, I know this about myself. And so if you feel like I'm leaving you behind or steamrolling you, let's talk. I'm open to that. And that is the way a personal brand can be put into action. Because what it does with that person is they say, oh, she sees that. And now I feel a little bit more connected to her. And they buy in. So thinking about it for buy-in and kind of making your connections with people a little bit deeper, a little bit faster. We all have a need for that in different places in our life.
Absolutely right. That's genius. We got some really, really good questions. So I want to answer a couple questions that folks submitted. So one that turned up was, do you have any tips for busy executives to build a personal brand without burning out?
I love this one because I feel like one of the main reasons I care about this work is because of how much I have been burnt out and how many other people. This is such a great source of energy to head off burnout or also to help recover from it. So the number one thing I would say to anybody who hears themselves in that statement is this is about a muscle that you're exercising that most of us have lost sight of over time for a number of reasons. In corporate America, we don't encourage people to focus on individuals. We're supposed to blend in. So we're kind of flipping that around, and that's going to take time to get back to your 10-year-old self, right? Or your 10-year-old level of knowledge of who you are. So think of it like a muscle that you're exercising and do little pieces. Make it people talk about yoga as a practice, right? Because yoga is never perfect. This is a little bit like that. And I know that sounds cheesy, and that's sort of okay. Take the pressure off, set aside some time. What I often say to people, I'm a huge fan of writing. The act of putting your pen to a page is demonstrated, research driven, we know, to help connect you to your thoughts. And so what I like to do is find some good writing prompts. I have like 5 million of them. Many of them are on my website. And set aside an hour of your best mental energy, not your worst. Don't shove this in between your 3 and 4 o'clock calls. But for me, it's 8 a.m. is always my best thinking. Sometimes on Saturdays, if my kids are away at skiing or something, I'll sit down with a cup of coffee. And for some reason on Saturday, I always feel ready to think about creative things and write and just do it and take the pressure off making it perfect. It will help you feel like you're doing something. And I guarantee the more time you spend answering questions about like, what is my best day at work? What do I feel like when I'm doing the thing that I do so well? What do I know about this work that I do that I want other people to know? The more that you do that, you're going to start saying those words in meetings. It has an immediate impact. And then everything kind of takes off from there.
Absolutely. Another question that's kind of similar, and I think you spoke to this a little bit, is how to find clarity in creating a personal brand when you've done a lot of different things. You've had kind of a winding road in your career.
I love that question so much. I actually wrote a post about this a couple of weeks ago because I was talking to a client who was like, oh, I've had my career needs to make sense. My career's been so winding. And I'm like, thank you, because how boring to have a completely linear career path. I don't know why we continue to fall into this trap of thinking we're supposed to have a linear path. And what I find, someone in my speech actually yesterday raised her hand and said, how do I build a brand for who I am over in this part of my life and also when over in this part of my life? And I said, I bet if we talked about these two things, but I found out later she has a full-time job inside of a company and she also started a social enterprise. But the two are definitely connected by like a passion that she shares and they're reinforcing. And so I find that usually it's not as hard as we make it out to be to connect things. But also we should revel in the joy of talking about and weaving the narrative of how those things all connect. It's definitely possible, but sometimes it's hard to do that. That's where it's great to get a friend to say, let me talk through this with you and let's see if we can start to make sense, because we get too hung up on the specifics in our own journey. To be brief about that, embrace that. If your path has been winding, that is interesting. Share it. Don't water it down. Resist it.
Definitely. 100%. Couldn't agree more. All right. So another good question is, if you have limited time and resources, where do you begin?
Okay. I like this one. So 2 things. The first is the writing. I mentioned the building prompts. I have a framework that I use that's based on basic brand strategy principles. And it's got just a couple of key building blocks. So we can certainly, link people to that. So the writing, but also, and just accepting that that's going to be a part of the process. People who spend time writing maybe once a week. I know it feels like a lot, but it's definitely going to have a huge impact. And also asking for input. So I always try to encourage people to have a good balance of listening to themselves, because we need to do the work. Nothing's more frustrating when you get like a network request from somebody who's like, hey, I'm looking for a new job. Can you let me know if you know of anyone? And it's like, now I have to sit here and figure out what you need. You have to figure out what you need and then tell me, and I'll see if I can provide that. It's up to us to know ourselves, right? So we have to do the introspection, but then I also encourage us to get input. And you probably remember I have these 3 golden questions I'm totally obsessed with. I think they're genius. I did come up with them, but I have everybody who works with me in any capacity send an email to 5 people in their lives. They're somewhere in the middle of that Venn diagram between personal and professional context, people who will always be happy to hear from you. And you ask them, how would you describe my superpower? What would you say it feels like to work with me when I'm at my very best? And the most important question, what do you wish I celebrated more about myself? And then everyone I work with sends all these responses to me, and I get to spend like a huge chunk of my time reading what other people say about people they care about. And to a person, we're always more generous talking about other people, right, than we are about ourselves. But it unlocks something where you'll see that there's hidden value you provide that you have a bias you overlook because it's so natural to you. That's how you know you're getting closer to something that needs to be part of your brand.
That exercise was so incredible. And I would absolutely recommend that everyone do it. It is a great place to start. And yeah, it surfaced things that I had literally never thought of about myself. Like just it hadn't occurred to me, to exactly your point. And I was like, and it's surprisingly consistent. People who have no interaction with each other and haven't even worked with you in the same context, and you're still getting like, there's going to be through lines. So I would totally ditto that. If you have limited time and resources, do the hard work of getting to know yourself a little bit better. If you need somebody to hold a mirror up, Kat is amazing at it, and start writing so that you can begin flexing and building that muscle, because you're going to need it, and you can use it however you want to. Like
Listen to
very,
yourself. Yeah.
yeah, listen to yourself. Um, and if you want to get super tactical, like, yeah, then you can go into the marketing aspects of defining where you show up and how often you show up and all of that. But that's going to be personal to you and the bandwidth you have and the budget you have and all of that. And it's not, none of those exercises are going to be helpful unless you're really grounded in what you said earlier, the strategy and the self-knowledge. And yeah, I think we're pretty much at time, but one last question. How big does a personal brand need to be in order to see a return from it, i.e. leads?
Yes. So this, of course, the consultant in me wants to say it depends, right? It depends on what your objective is. So I would say the client that I mentioned of mine who said she got reached out to by a recruiter, she started doing this work because she wanted to figure out where she's going next and start to send signals that would be responded to. I'd say that's a complete ROI, right? Because that's very much going to immediately help set her up. It shows that people are responding to her brand. And I think the way that that question was written implies to me that somebody's building a brand to support their business. So it all has to be connected to what your business is. I often tell people who are solopreneurs or who are founders who are starting companies that are still small, your personal brand is your brand identity and your positioning statement, your positioning strategy, like who your target customer is, what your value prop is, what's your differentiator, what's the benefit or the value of that, and what are your offerings. That's your business positioning. They should live together because your business is what they're buying or how they're buying from you. Your personal brand is who they're buying and who they're buying from. And so if the person asking that question was building a business or their consultancy, I would say that we could very directly tie the personal brand to the ROI because it's serving their positioning strategy and what they're trying to sell.
100%. It also works really well with early stage, like even tech companies, because so much of when you don't have the proof you're new, people are buying trust. And the only way that you're going to be able to build that is if people can know, like, and trust you. And they can only do that if you're visible in some way. And you know, you can show up on LinkedIn posting about whatever you want to, and you will get some attention for it. But having the like self-knowledge and knowing this, what you stand for in your story, I think that makes things a lot more memorable. Like that's what I've noticed about the people that your work and also the other folks that I know that you've worked with, the consistency in not just the fact that they show up, but the way that they show up is how you get to know them and build trust. And I feel like that's really the secret sauce. And yeah, you can probably start seeing leads as quickly as you start showing up. It depends on how you measure them. But
it depends
yeah,
on how you measure them. I think that's so. I love that you mentioned trust. Just the last thing I have to say on that, especially with tech founders. I think we talked about this. I spoke to someone who works with climate tech companies, and she was saying everyone in their portfolio has a very similar why. And so you can't, which is fine. That's kind of price for entry, and that should make sense. You should be passionate about climate if you're working in climate tech, but that alone is not going to convince people to buy from you, right? Or to buy into you. And for a lot of tech founders, the most overlooked opportunity is the origin story. I want to hear about the spark, the moment that you realized there was a thing that you could fix and the idea that you had, because that's going to build my trust. It's not what are you going to do, right? And this is a lesson that I think applies to almost any business, but it's why should I care about what you're doing? Why do you care about what you're doing? And then marrying that up with the area that you've chosen that you have passion for. There's so many different ways we can anchor people, but to your point, especially if that's where the real value is going to come for people in those spaces, is building that trust. And like the metrics I see for my own ROI and leads is usually reflected in the depth of engagement. A client that I was talking to this morning, I asked her, I was like, I don't even remember how we got connected. And she couldn't remember either, but she's been following me on LinkedIn for like a year. And she said that the tone that I use in my posts really struck her. And for years, she's been saying, how can I work with her? When can I work with her? That's ROI, right?
Absolutely. And honestly, like that's why I wanted to work with you, is exactly that reason, because of the way that you showed up, and also just that moment of building trust and authenticity, and like otherwise it wouldn't have happened, because this is hard work, and
you don't want to do it just
and so
yeah.
no, you don't want to trust all that to just anybody. But I think that is your thoughts on why it matters for entrepreneurs. Like, I think that's a great place to end. Kat, thank you so much. This was an absolute delight, and as always. And I will make sure to drop your website in the comments here in just 1 minute. But thank you so much for your time, and I am glad we got to chat.
Thank you, Kinsey. So much fun.
Bye.